Good evening, writers. We continue our talk on the Minutia of Writing by talking about a very, very small but very important concept, the word said. Now, before we begin, I'm going to distinguish between two types of words. It's something you might have come across if you've ever taken any amount of linguistics. It's the difference between function words and content words. Most words are content words. These include nouns, adjectives, verbs, adverbs. These are words that describe things. These are the meat of whatever it is you're saying or whatever it is you're writing. The words like bookshelf, walk, think, talk. It's anything that you can describe, whether that's real or imaginary. They're things that you can conceivably say exist. That being said, if content words includes most things that you can conceive of as existing, what are function words? Well, function words are words that specifically deal with grammatical contexts. That's a terrible way of describing it. Let's try something better. Function words are words that make a sentence work. They're articles like the and a, they're pronouns like he, she, it, zir. They're conjunctions and, for, because. They're words that you use to link to ideas, therefore, nevertheless, regardless. Function words are words that exist within the grammatical structure of your language in order to make those ideas easier to communicate. The definitions of these words is usually very hard to describe because they're so based on their function in a sentence that they don't really have any meaning outside of their role in what it does linguistically. The words that exist simply to clarify your sentences, to make your content words easier to understand or easier to contextualize. Now, why, as a writer, should we pay attention to these distinctions? The point of this episode is to talk about the word said. It's a word that, as a writer, you're going to have to use a lot. Every time someone speaks, you'll either use it or use a word similar to it. One of the things that makes this word so interesting is that it exists somewhere in the gray space between function word and content word. Said is a content word. So you can describe someone saying something. You can point to a person speaking and say, they're saying. That's what saying is. But when you're writing, said usually works as a grammatical function when you have something in quotation marks that's a character speaking, and then you put the phrase, this person said, after that sentence. In this case, you are talking about what they're doing. You're saying they're saying it, but at the same time, you've already denoted that with the quotation marks, and the said mostly functions as a way to grammatically tie up the fact that you're saying this person said that. Now, why is this important? There's a mistake that's very common with beginner writers, and it all stems down to something I talked about last episode, where we're taught not to repeat ourselves if we can avoid it. Now, I'm not going to repeat myself here. If you want more, you can look at the last episode, but long story short, try not to repeat yourself. Now, as I mentioned last week, taking this advice literally can get you in a lot of trouble. The word said will appear a lot, pretty much no matter what you're writing. You're going to have to write that word a lot. You're going to have to see that word on the page 6 or 7 times a page for your entirety of your work. And it can be very tempting to look at them and say, you know what, I need to change it up. I need to make that said into something more evocative, something more descriptive, something more imaginary. And then you'll go through, you'll take a thesaurus out, and you'll start flipping through all of these words that mean said, but aren't really that word. And so you'll go about, instead of said, he shouted, he spoke, he expressed, he posed. He pondered aloud. Now, as you can see from this example, this is getting pretty ridiculous. Individually, all of these phrases aren't inherently bad. Most of these examples are a good way to add a little bit of flavor to the text, if used conservatively and when the text itself can't really represent the mood that you're trying to express. But if you throw them all over the place, if you use every word except said to avoid repeating yourself, this will cause a lot of problems because not only will these words start to lose their meaning because if everything is emphasized, nothing is emphasized. Because if you start searching for more and more abstract ways to communicate the fact that somebody said something, like the adjective problem, you're focusing too much on describing how people are saying something instead of doing the better and more direct thing of making the thing that they're saying self-evident, making the way that they're talking express the mood that you want to express. Because you shouldn't be relying on a little blurb at the end, he exclaimed or he accused suspiciously. Your text and the scenario that you're describing should make that self-evident. It should come across in your writing that these are the moods that these characters have.
You can't just have your characters announce how they feel. That makes me feel angry.
It's the old showing versus telling rule. Show your characters expressing these emotions, having these ways of speaking. Don't simply put a tagline at the end of a quotation and assume that your job is done. That being said, If you're looking to make your writing a little bit more engaging, there are a lot of tools you can use to make it flow better, to make things work a little better. First off, learn grammatically how to do this. You're going to have to do this all the time. Make sure you know exactly how to format people speaking. Whether the quotation marks are before some introductory text, whether they're after, whether you have quotation interrupted by something, more quotation, interrupted by another thing, more quotations. Figure out how that works. Make sure you know that ins and outs. It's one of the reasons why a lot of quotations saying, blah, blah, he said, blah, 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 they said, blah, 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 she said, over and over again, means that you're really not making dynamic conversations, because conversations aren't just people standing stationary in front of each other, shouting lines back and forth. That's what elementary school plays are. That's not what your novel should be. That's not what your short story should sound like. Describe physically what's happening in the conversation. If someone talks with their hands, have their hands moving while they're talking. If somebody looks away, if somebody shrugs, if people express the smallest bit of emotional reaction to what's being said, mention that. Say Alice shrugged, and then go with what she said afterwards. That small bit of context lets you really feel what's happening in a scene, lets you know emotionally what's going on in the easiest and most direct way possible. And one of the advantages of doing stuff like that is that you don't have to say, Alice shrugged, words, Alice said, because when the quotation immediately follows something that Alice is doing, the readers will assume that Alice is saying that. Knowing the grammatical rules as point one will really help you make better conversations. And perhaps most importantly, if a conversation is getting boring, summarize it. You don't have to go through the motions of people saying, hey, it's good to see you. What are you doing today? I'm going to do this important thing. Oh, cool. Can you pick up some milk on the way? Don't include that. If you really need to, just say, like, they talked about picking up milk at the store and then had this important conversation that immediately followed. You can do that. You're allowed to do that. This is, of course, part of the general rule of skipping the boring parts of people's lives, but it's still important to keep in mind that conversations don't have to be presented in full. Nothing in your novel has to be presented in full. Nothing in your novel has to be presented. Of course, after all this, don't be afraid of using the word said a lot. Most readers aren't going to be paying attention to the number of times you've used the word said. It's the simplest, most direct way of expressing that this character is speaking. If there is any chance that a reader might not be able to figure out who's saying this line and who's saying that line, just put a this person said, that person said. This is really important when you're in a conversation with 3 or more individuals. It can sometimes be very difficult to keep track of who's saying what, and you can't always rely on the quotation after quotation with indents to say that people are alternating speaking, because in a triangle situation, it doesn't always go in order. And don't, of course, be afraid to use synonyms for said when you mean them. One of the characters in my novels always has the words shouted instead of said because he's ridiculously loud and obnoxious all the time. And this is only possible because I don't use the word shouted in many other contexts, so it's possible for the readers to pick up on this and understand this as a character trait. But if you randomly sprinkle the word shouted all over the place, then one character who always shouts isn't exactly an outlier, and you lose the capacity to have this characterization expressed simply through word choice. And so that's why you should shy away from the word said. But don't worry, a lot of professional writers occasionally make this mistake. Take this example from Harry Potter. We're not going to use magic, Ron ejaculated loudly. That line is in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, a professional book for mass production that really put in a weird line for just because it avoided using the word said or exclaimed or shouted. Ejaculated loudly. You can just say exclaimed. Or said. The text pretty much implies that it's kind of a shouty... Don't be afraid to use the word said. That's the takeaway. Let the text speak for itself. That's all for this time on the Young Writers Vlog. Thank you for joining me, and make sure to check out next episode when we talk about how to use emphasis properly. That was awful. Nothing in your novel has to be presented in full. Nothing in your novel has to be presented. Nothing in your novel. Nothing.